Parts of it? What parts?
We are an open and affirming.
Open and affirming, okay. Where's LJ? You know this. There you are. Okay, well you can open your front of your bulletin. It has our mission statement. The Kirk of Brae is a progressive church, rooted in Christianity and welcoming the spiritual seekers from all backgrounds who are pursuing depth in relationship with God, earth, and a community through engaged faith and social justice. I know it is a mouthful, but I think we really mean all of these things. Lately, I've been thinking about the part in the mission statement that talks about pursuing depth and what that means and what that looks like for us as a church. We're working hard as a church not to be surface, which is actually really challenging in a society where we know that surface is all that is safe. I mean, we have gone from general surface relationships in the life of the culture to digital surface relationships, where we engage people only online with even less depth. Meet that with our political ideologies, where we only read and consider ideas that feed what we already believe, and refuse or classify some things that challenge us as fake, and there's not a lot of depth to be found in our world right now. And so I think we as a church are pushing against that. Maybe the church is always supposed to push against that. And one of the ways that we are living that out and pushing against these surface relationships is through our seasonal groups. If you don't know, for about 3 years we have had a small group of people that come together and they choose a theme and plan the seasonal theme. So we have a theme that stretches throughout the fall and the winter and the spring and the summer that is done by a different group every time on one topic. We have done things like change and love languages and groundwork and spiritual disciplines. And the one we find ourselves in now, if you have been here recently, you will know, is consent and covenant. Now, before I came to the Kirk, I used to be afraid of preaching on the same thing 2 weeks in a row because I thought I'd run out of things to say. But what I have found is that the only reason you would run out of things to say is if you stayed on the surface. But preaching on the same theme for as many as 11 weeks demands that we pursue depth as we dive deeply into these topics. And that has been abundantly true with our current theme of consent. We started talking about what consent is with a 4-part definition. Consent is freely given. Consent is communicated in mutually understandable words and actions. Consent is given in the present and given for each specific act. And through this definition, we have looked at far more than consent for physical intimacy. Though we have looked at that, but we have also talked about consent with the earth and consent in what we eat and consent in relationships with loved ones and consent with God. And I have heard this word consent come up in conversations across the life of the church in these last few months, as we are all wrestling with what it looks like to be a part of a community that values consent. But while we are doing this, I have noticed something, maybe within all of us, but certainly within myself. In small moments, do we always pause and ask, where is that line? So at the end of worship, I usually stand at the back door and I shake hands with some people and hug some people. And I've thought, well, if we really, do I need to stop each person as they go out? And would you like a handshake, a hug, or none of the above? As we move through that line. Because if we're really taking consent seriously, maybe we should all just keep our hands in our pockets and then we wouldn't have an issue, right? Wrong. Then we would have a big issue. Because a no-touch policy and even a no-touch culture is not the goal. And so as we go into the depth of what consent means, today we have to challenge it a little bit of the assumptions that come alongside 3 months of talking about consent. We have talked explicitly about the ways in which consent has been denied to people, particularly through physical touch. We have acknowledged the pain that has been caused in our world and our church and the church by sexual assault, including in the wider church clergy sexual assault. And so it might seem like the logical conclusion is to keep people safe, and even as a church or as a society at large, that we become a place that we do not touch others to avoid abuse or the perception of abuse. But that is actually not what consent is about. Ashley Montagu is an anthropologist, and she argues that resistance to touch is what is often the reaction, is understandable in a society that has so confounded love and sex and affection and touch. Yet talking about consent is not an attempt to scare people to keep their hands to themselves. Actually, when I was in youth ministry, I would gather my youth group every day, and we would start a certain way. I probably shared that, but at the end of every youth group, we would grab hands and offer a prayer. And I talked about what it meant to be that community of just a bunch of teenagers gathered together, as I talked about it as a hand-holding community. Because when we did that, and of course they always had the freedom to not hold hands if they didn't feel comfortable, but when we would grab hands with one another, something shifted. All of those difficult dynamics that happens when you have a group of teenagers in one room dissipated. It wasn't so important as you held hands and entered into a time and space of prayer as one community. It wasn't so important, or it didn't seem to matter who was cool and who wasn't, who was an athlete or who wasn't, who was a little bit socially awkward and who wasn't, who had cooties and who didn't. It all seemed to melt away for the moments we held hands. And in those moments they shared their joys, big ones and small ones, and their worries, big ones and small ones that I would bet they wouldn't have been comfortable sharing 5 minutes earlier while we were sitting on the couches. They felt safe as a hand-holding community. Maybe if we're true to this text, though, we should be a foot-holding community. I mean, that is what happens after all. If we look at this text that Abba read for us, we realize that it is scandalous. There are many sermons that I have heard, and maybe you have heard, that try to reduce the scandal. We talk about the ways in which houses were not so locked down like ours are. They were more open to the air, so this woman didn't have to break a window to get into Simon's house. And yet she was there, and this was scandalous, as she approached Jesus, the teacher, and began to weep on his feet and dry his feet with her hair. I mean, I want all of you to sit where you're sitting and imagine that someone walks in off the street and bends down in front of you, removes your shoes, and starts crying over your feet and wiping them with your hair. None of it's happening to everyone, but just to you. Imagine what you would feel. Imagine what all of those other people in the room would feel as they saw this. This was not something that was expected, no matter the day or time. But it's only fair in this season to name where consent was not offered. Simon did not welcome this woman into his home, nor did he or the Pharisees consent to this intimate scene that takes place as she washes Jesus' feet. And while she does not ask Jesus, "May I wash and kiss your feet?" there must be the mutually understandable consent, because it's clear that Jesus doesn't reject her. He does not put up a boundary. He does not withdraw, even though everyone else in the room really wants him to. We read that this was not only weird and gross to the host, but seemed like this action was leading Simon and the Pharisees to dismiss Jesus and his teachings altogether, because while we don't know this woman's name, what we do know is she was a sinner. And so Simon is thinking to himself, if Jesus was a prophet, then he would know who this woman was, and he would definitely not be allowing her to touch him in this way. It didn't occur to them that Jesus did know exactly who she was and still welcomed her touch. And Jesus does not stop her. Actually, he draws attention to her. "Do you see this woman?" he says. We don't know her name. We don't know all of her story, but we see her. Usually, the scripture, when it is preached on, is used to preach on forgiveness, and appropriately so. Because when Simon, the host of the dinner party, questions the interaction, Jesus offers a parable about two debtors, one who owed 10 times the amount of the other. And Jesus asks Jesus says both of them cannot pay their debt. And so the one that held the debts forgave them both, and asked which one would be more grateful. Simon responds saying, the one with the greater debt. It is a way of recognizing that much has been forgiven of this woman. And so her love, her gratitude is greater than Simon's, who doesn't feel as though he had that much debt in the first place. Simon is therefore able to stay appropriate and surface in his relationship with Jesus because he doesn't need forgiveness. He doesn't really need Jesus, so it seems. In the same way, I think we can get confused in conversations of consent. That we so want to protect ourselves and others that we tell ourselves we don't really need to ask for consent or offer consent. We can just keep to ourselves. It's easier to stay on the surface. If we have to ask for consent, then we set ourselves up for rejection and we make the other person feel uncomfortable if they choose to deny it. So it's better to just avoid one another, to keep our hands in our pockets and to move along. But do you see this woman? I mean, we do, right? This encounter appears in all four Gospels in some fashion. And while she doesn't have a name, the story is told again and again so that we are forced not only to see her, but to see her touching Jesus. We know that Jesus could have easily avoided this whole thing. He had more power than this woman. He could have easily denied her touch as well as denied her presence at this dinner party, but he didn't. And a side note, abusive touch much more often comes from a power imbalanced relationship. A boss will touch an employee much before an employee will touch their boss. Those in power feel they have access to the bodies of those with less power. It is something to be aware of. But what we see here is actually the opposite. The one with less power is emboldened to reach across the social boundary, and then Jesus receives that touch. And I don't think that he permitted this touch just to be nice to her. The touch of the sinner was of value to him. Jackie was telling me this week about a marriage and family counselor that she knows who said that in a relationship, usually people are either really good at giving love or really good at receiving love. But rarely are they good at both. And it took this counselor himself facing a crisis of his own in his own relationship to realize how important it is that both are needed. If it is easy to give, we must also learn how to receive. And if it is easy to receive, we must also learn how to give. And so when we look at Jesus, we see him receive, which is so odd because we think of him as a giver, the one who reaches out his hand and touches those who are untouchable, to help people restoring their bodies and minds and spirits to wholeness. But so too, Jesus, who is our example, needed touch, needed the love that was literally poured onto his feet. He consented to this touch. And now I know we all have different ways of understanding exactly who Jesus was, the Son of God or the one who most profoundly did or does the work of God. The church has been arguing this point as long as there has been a church. But it's important for us in the conversation of consent that we look at who Jesus was as he is our example, the one that we follow, and to see his need for touch, the necessity of touch, the way he honored this touch. When in a safe and just environment, he is calling on us to bless the gift of touch. Because it's not enough to know the power of touch through its destruction. We also have to know its beauty. And we see that here. Jesus was embodied. He was human, and he needed what humans need. Scientists say we need at least 8 touches a day to be healthy. Our skin is, after all, our largest sensory organ, and they say it is the first sense to develop in the womb and the last to remain upon death. We know when babies are first born, they need as much skin-to-skin contact as they can get. And study shows that this remains. It is a part of our embodiment. It's true for all of us. It was true for Jesus. It was true for this woman that we see, but is known only as a sinner. And so in this season of consent, we celebrate that it is our bodies and our choices, but may our faith compel us to push us past what is easy and what is comfortable and what is surface. To not be afraid to ask for consent and not be afraid when we are comfortable to give it. What if we were a hand-holding church, able to break across the barriers we put up to protect ourselves, able to recognize not only our own embodiment, but the bodies of others, to recognize and honor each one. What if it wasn't just the church, but our neighborhoods? It was a hand-holding neighborhood, or our communities, or our country, or our world? What if we allowed skin to touch skin, not out of power, but consenting in love? I often think about a moment I had. You know, Jackie and the kids make those manna bags, bags to give to our homeless neighbors who we see. And we did it once for a classroom. And the teacher was nervous at the end of the day. The kids all put together these beautiful bags, and they decorated them and filled them with supplies that they had donated. And then the teacher became uncomfortable and said, a school teacher, and said that she didn't want to give these bags to children because she didn't want them interacting with the people they would be giving them to. And there's been many times my children have reached out and handed those bags to someone, and the person has reached back in and touched their hand. What if we were a hand-holding community, and we honored that touch, and we honored one another in the example and the embodiment of Christ? Amen.